I woke up as Cinderella, and the very first thing I noticed was not magic, destiny, or a sudden desire to sing with wildlife. It was that the floor was disgusting, like not metaphorically symbolic disgusting but physically. Aggressively, someone spilled something and decided Janelle was a cleaning method. Disgusting, and before I could even emotionally log that observation, my stepmother was already standing over me with her arms crossed like a department head, who had never read a policy but felt spiritually aligned with authority, saying, "Scrub it again." So I looked at the floor, then at her, then back at the floor and said calmly, "Sure. But quick clarification, before I recommit, are we talking about a one-time deliverable or a recurring responsibility? Because if this is long-term, I'd like to discuss pacing." And she froze like I'd just asked her to solve advanced calculus using vibes alone. So I smiled politely and added, "I'm not resisting, I just function better with clarity." Which somehow offended her on a personal level because she snapped, "You are here to work, not to speak." And I nodded enthusiastically and said, "Perfect, love that boundary, and just to align, is there a schedule or is this more of a vibes-based operation?" At which point the taller stepsister gasped so loudly, she nearly aspirated. The shorter one whispered, "Why does she sound confident?" And the stepmother yelled, "Stop talking." So I said, "Of course," paused exactly half a second, then continued. "But just to finish the thought, if I scrub floors every day without task rotation, resentment statistically builds, morale declines, and productivity suffers, not emotionally, just operationally." And she screamed, "Stop talking." So I asked gently, "Is the issue the content or the volume?" Which caused visible eye twitching and made the taller stepsister clutch her head and hiss, "She's doing it again." While I continued scrubbing because I wasn't trying to rebel. I was just multitasking, saying things like, "See, I'm scrubbing right now. This isn't defiance. This is commentary." And when the stepmother snapped, "I don't care how you feel," I said, "Oh good, me neither. I'm talking about output." Which made the shorter stepsister shriek, "Why is she like this?" And the taller one yell, "Stop explaining." Which of course prompted me to explain more gently, saying, "Okay, when people say stop explaining, they usually mean they're overwhelmed, not that the explanation itself is incorrect." At which point both of them screamed in unison. And that was before I reorganized the buckets, not as a statement but because having soap in 3 different corners felt unhinged. And a servant stopped and stared, and I said, "You can move them back if this disrupts your workflow." And he whispered like he was confessing a crime, "No one has ever asked me about my workflow." Which should have been my sign to stop, but instead I asked, "Do you prefer horizontal or vertical storage?" And suddenly 3 servants were debating shelf height while the taller stepsister screamed, "Why are they talking to her?" And the shorter one yelled, "She moved the buckets." Like I committed a felony. And by afternoon the house was visibly cleaner, and the stepmother noticed and said suspiciously, "This hall was filthy this morning." And I said yes, but we removed redundant steps. And she snapped, "I did not approve any changes." And I replied sincerely, "Oh, I didn't realize approval was required for efficiency." Which made the taller stepsister slap the table and scream, "Say sorry." And I said, "For which part, the improvement or the misunderstanding?" Which caused the shorter one to start pacing in tight circles, muttering, "I can't do this. I can't do this." And at dinner, where everyone sat except me, I watched them eat for a full minute before asking, "Quick question, is there a seating rationale here, or is this symbolic hierarchy?" And the stepmother said, "You eat later," and I nodded and asked, "Okay, is that discipline, tradition, or dramatic effect?" And she slammed her fork down screaming, "ENOUGH," which startled one stepsister into yelling, "Make her eat outside," and the other shouting, "Lock her in the basement." And I raised my hands calmly and said, "I'm just trying to understand the system." And the stepmother screamed, "There is nitrogen monoxide system." And I nodded slowly and said, "That explains literally everything," which made the taller stepsister let out a sound that was not quite a scream but not quite human either. And that night in the attic I realized this wasn't a fairy tale problem. It was a project problem. So the next morning I gathered everyone by simply standing in the kitchen and talking at a polite volume saying, "Good morning. This will be quick. Totally optional." And when the stepmother stormed in shrieking, "What is this?" I said, "A stand-up." And she screamed, "I did not approve this." And I said, "Of course not. That's why it's optional." And I continued, "Today's goals are clean house, minimal yelling, zero emotional breakdowns if possible." Which immediately triggered both stepsisters at once, one yelling, "Say he's talking about you," and the other screaming, "Stop making goals." And when a servant timidly asked, "If we finish early, can we rest?" I said, "Let's call that a stretch goal." And the taller stepsister lost it completely, shouting, "Why does she know words?" While the shorter one grabbed the table and screamed, "This is my house." And by noon people were lighter. The house was functional. And the stepmother cornered me hissing, "You are manipulating them." And I said, "Okay, let's assume I am. What specific negative outcome are you worried about?" And she opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and finally shouted, "They're listening to you." Like it was a curse. And I nodded sympathetically and said, "That happens when people feel included," which caused both stepsisters to scream simultaneously. One yelling, "Stop including them," and the other yelling, "Stop explaining feelings." And then the trumpet sounded, and a royal messenger announced the prince's ball. The stepsisters exploded, one screaming, "I need a new dress." The other screaming, "I need a better face." The stepmother grabbed my arm and hissed, "You are not going." And I smiled brightly and said, "Totally fine. Then I'll just flag that excluding a motivated contributor from a major stakeholder event may impact morale and create long-term resentment." And the taller stepsister collapsed into a chair yelling, "She said stakeholders again," while the shorter one covered her ears screaming, "Make her stop talking." And as all three of them stared at me like I'd summoned a demon using nothing but modern office language, I realized something important. This story wasn't just breaking. It was actively screaming, and all I had done was explain myself politely.